I never thought I'd meet someone who could make me want to live again. That probably sounds dramatic, but when you're staring down the barrel of your own mortality at 28, everything gets a little dramatic. 3 months before I met Daniel, I'd been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the kind with a name so long and clinical that it felt like it belonged to someone else's life, not mine. But there I was, sitting in an oncologist's office while she explained treatment protocols and survival statistics with the kind of gentle professionalism that told me she'd delivered this news 1,000 times before. I remember walking out of that appointment into the bright afternoon sunlight, and everything looked different. The same Seattle street I'd walked down hundreds of times suddenly felt foreign, like I was seeing it through glass. People rushed past with their coffee cups and their phones pressed to their ears, worried about deadlines and dinner plans, and I wanted to grab them by the shoulders and scream that none of it mattered, that they were wasting their perfectly healthy, cancer-free lives on things that didn't mean anything at all. But I didn't. I just went home to my studio apartment in Capitol Hill, climbed into bed even though it was 2 in the afternoon, and stared at the ceiling until the light changed and the room grew dark around me. The first round of chemo hit me like a freight train. I'd read all the pamphlets, watch the videos, talk to the support group, but nothing really prepares you for how it feels to have poison pumped into your veins on purpose. My older sister Melissa sat with me through those first infusions, holding my hand and making terrible jokes that I was too nauseous to laugh at. She'd taken time off from her job in Portland, sleeping on my couch and pretending like this wasn't completely upending her life too. I lost my hair within 3 weeks. I'd always had thick, dark hair that I was probably too vain about, and watching it come out in clumps in the shower felt like losing pieces of myself. I shaved it all off one night at 2 in the morning, standing in front of my bathroom mirror with my electric razor, and when I looked at my reflection afterward, I barely recognized the gaunt stranger staring back at me. Work had been understanding when I'd asked for medical leave from my job as a graphic designer at a small marketing firm. My boss had sent flowers and a card signed by everyone in the office. But I knew what it meant. I knew they were already redistributing my projects, already moving on without me. Life doesn't pause just because yours does. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, though. It was the loneliness. My friends tried it first. They'd text and visit and bring me things I was too sick to eat. But after a few weeks, the texts became less frequent. The visits tapered off. People have their own lives, their own problems, and I understood that. I really did. But understanding didn't make my apartment feel any less empty. That's where I was mentally when I met Daniel. 4 months into treatment, thin as a rail, bald, exhausted down to my bones, and so completely done with fighting that I'd started seriously considering just stopping the chemo and letting nature take its course. My oncologist had mentioned a clinical trial, some new targeted therapy that was showing promise, but I'd need to be strong enough to qualify. I didn't feel strong enough for anything. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late October, and I'd forced myself to leave the apartment for the first time in 5 days. There was a small independent bookstore called Twice Told Tales about 3 blocks from my place, and I'd always loved it. The owner, an elderly woman named Ruth, had never made a big deal about my appearance changing, which I appreciated more than she probably knew. I just wanted to be around books, around something that felt normal and permanent when everything else in my life felt temporary. I was standing in the poetry section, running my fingers along the spines without really seeing the titles, when someone spoke beside me. That one's incredible if you haven't read it. I turned, and there he was. Tall, maybe 6'2", with sandy blonde hair that fell across his forehead and these warm hazel eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He was pointing at a collection by Ocean Vuong that I'd actually read twice already. "It is," I managed to say, my voice coming out rougher than I'd intended. I hadn't really talked to anyone except doctors and Melissa in weeks. "One of my favorites." His smile widened. "Good taste. I'm Daniel." "Alex," I said, and when he extended his hand, I shook it, acutely aware of how thin my own hand looked in his, how the veins stood out against my pale skin. If he noticed, he didn't show it. We ended up talking for 20 minutes right there in the poetry section. He was a teacher, 7th grade English, and the way he talked about his students made something warm unfold in my chest. He had this energy about him, this genuine enthusiasm for life that I hadn't felt from anyone in months. He didn't ask me what I did for work, didn't ask about the obvious signs of illness. He just talked to me like I was a regular person, and I hadn't realized how desperately I needed that. When I finally said I should probably get going, he hesitated for just a second before saying, "This might be forward, but would you want to grab coffee sometime? There's a great place right around the corner." I should have said no. I should have made up an excuse, protected him from the inevitable disappointment of getting to know someone who might not be around in 6 months. But standing there in that bookstore, looking at his hopeful expression, I found myself saying yes instead. We went to the coffee shop that same afternoon. It was one of those cozy Seattle places with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. Daniel ordered some complicated latte, and I got chamomile tea because coffee made my nausea worse. We sat in a corner booth, and he told me about growing up in a small town in eastern Washington, about coming out to his parents when he was 19, about moving to Seattle for college and never leaving. I told him about my graphic design work, about my love for old movies and jazz music, about my sister and her 2 kids who I rarely got to see anymore. I didn't tell him about the cancer. Not yet. For those 2 hours, I just wanted to be Alex, not Alex the cancer patient. But as we were getting ready to leave, I stood up too quickly and had to grab the edge of the table as a wave of dizziness hit me. Daniel's hand was immediately on my elbow, steadying me, concern clear on his face. "Are you okay?" I could have lied. I could have blamed it on not eating enough or standing up too fast. But something about the genuine worry in his eyes made me decide on honesty instead. "Can we walk for a bit? There's something I should probably tell you." We walked slowly through the drizzly Seattle afternoon, and I told him everything. About the diagnosis, the chemo, the clinical trial my doctor wanted me to try, the exhaustion that had seeped into my bones and made me feel like I was already half ghost. I told him I understood if he wanted to bail, that I wouldn't blame him for not wanting to get involved with someone whose future was measured in survival percentages instead of years. Daniel listened without interrupting, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. When I finally finished talking, we'd reached a small park with a covered bench, and he gestured for us to sit down. "Thank you for telling me," he said quietly. "That took courage." I laughed, but it came out bitter. "I'm not feeling particularly courageous these days." He turned to face me fully, and the intensity in his gaze made my breath catch. "Can I tell you something? My dad died of pancreatic cancer when I was 15. It was fast, brutal, and it broke my family apart for a while. I watched him fight, and I watched him give up, and I learned something from both." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "What I learned was that being sick doesn't make you less of a person. It doesn't make you less worthy of connection, of friendship, of whatever else might develop. And I also learned that none of us are guaranteed tomorrow anyway. We just pretend we are." Tears were burning behind my eyes, and I blinked them back. "I just don't want to be someone's tragedy." "You're not," Daniel said firmly. "You're someone I met in a bookstore who has excellent taste in poetry and who I'd really like to get to know better. Whatever time that is, whether it's 50 years or 5 months, if you'll let me." I did let him. Over the next few weeks, Daniel became a constant presence in my life. He'd come over after school with takeout from whatever restaurant he thought might appeal to my diminished appetite. We'd watch movies on my laptop, his shoulder warm against mine on my second-hand couch. He never treated me like I was fragile, never looked at me with pity. When I had bad days, days where I couldn't get out of bed and the nausea was so bad I couldn't keep water down, he'd sit beside me and read aloud from whatever book he was teaching his students. He was there the day I went in for the screening for the clinical trial. My oncologist, Dr. Patterson, had explained that the new therapy was showing remarkable results in patients with my specific genetic markers, but my white blood cell count needed to improve before I could qualify. I'd been trying to eat better, rest more, but my body felt like it was betraying me at every turn. Daniel sat in the waiting room during the blood draw, and when I came out, I could see the question in his eyes. I just shook my head. I wouldn't know the results for a few days. That night, lying in my bed with Daniel beside me, fully clothed, just holding me, I finally let myself cry. Really cry. For the first time since the diagnosis. All the fear and anger and grief I'd been holding back came pouring out, and he just held me tighter, his hand moving in slow circles on my back. "I'm so tired," I whispered against his chest. "I'm so tired of fighting." "I know," he murmured. "I know you are. What if I can't do this anymore?" He pulled back just enough to look at me, his hand coming up to cup my face. "Then we'll figure out what comes next together. But Alex, I need you to know something. Since I met you, I've watched you get up every day and face something that would break most people. That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing I've ever seen. It doesn't feel strong." "It never does," he said. "Strength never feels like strength when you're in the middle of it. It just feels like surviving." The call came 3 days later. My white blood cell count was up, not by much, but enough. I qualified for the trial. Dr. Patterson explained that the new therapy was intense, that there would be side effects, that there were no guarantees. But there was hope. Real, tangible hope. I said yes, not because I was suddenly filled with fighting spirit, or because I'd had some grand epiphany about life. I said yes because of the way Daniel had looked at me that night, because of the future I could almost see reflected in his eyes. I said yes because for the first time in months I had something to fight for that wasn't just survival. I had someone who made me want to see what tomorrow might bring. The new treatment was brutal in different ways than the chemo had been. Instead of the crushing nausea and fatigue, I dealt with joint pain and headaches and strange neurological symptoms that made my hands shake. But Dr. Patterson monitored me closely, adjusting dosages, and slowly, incrementally, I started to improve. My first clear scan came in January, 3 months after starting the trial. I remember sitting in Dr. Patterson's office, Daniel's hand gripping mine so tightly I could feel his pulse as she pulled up the images on her computer screen. "The tumors have shrunk significantly," she said, and I watched her face break into the first genuine smile I'd seen from her. "This is exactly the response we were hoping for." I couldn't speak. Daniel made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and then we were both crying, holding each other in that sterile office while Dr. Patterson tactfully pretended to review her notes. Recovery wasn't linear. There were setbacks, days where my counts dropped and we had to pause treatment, days where I was convinced it had all been temporary and the cancer was coming back. But Daniel was there through all of it, steady and patient and refusing to let me disappear into my fear. He started staying over most nights, and slowly my apartment stopped feeling like a place where I was waiting to die and started feeling like a home. He brought plants that I was convinced I'd kill, but that somehow thrived on my windowsill. He filled my fridge with actual food instead of the meal replacement shakes I'd been living on. He made me laugh, really laugh, for the first time in almost a year. 6 months into the trial, Dr. Patterson used a word I'd been afraid to even think: remission. It was early, she cautioned. I'd need to continue treatment, continue monitoring, but the cancer was undetectable in my latest scans. That night, Daniel took me to a nice restaurant downtown, the kind of place I never would have bothered with before because I was always saving money for some vague future plan. We sat by the window overlooking the city lights, and he reached across the table to take my hand. I love you," he said, simple and direct, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "I've loved you since that day in the bookstore when you tried to pretend you were fine, and I could see you were falling apart. I love how you fight even when you're convinced you can't. I love your terrible taste in jazz music and the way you cry at every movie we watch. I love you, Alex, and I need you to know that whatever happens next, that's not going to change." My vision blurred with tears. "I love you too. I think I have since you showed up at my apartment with Thai food and insisted on watching all 8 Harry Potter movies because I mentioned I'd never seen them." He grinned. "That was a cultural emergency that required immediate intervention. I'm still not convinced they're better than the books." "Heresy," he said, but he was still smiling, and in that moment, sitting across from this man who had walked into my life when I was at my lowest and somehow made me believe in futures again, I felt something I hadn't felt in over a year. I felt happy. A year later, I was officially declared in remission. My hair had grown back, different than before, curlier and with strands of silver that Daniel said made me look distinguished. I'd gained back most of the weight I'd lost, and while I still had checkups every few months, the fear that used to wake me up at 3 in the morning had dulled to a manageable background hum. Daniel and I moved in together officially, to a bigger apartment in Fremont with actual bedroom space and a kitchen where we could both stand at the same time. I'd gone back to work part-time, easing back into design projects that actually excited me instead of just paying the bills. And on a rainy Sunday morning in March, 2 years after we met, Daniel asked me to marry him. We were just lying in bed, the kind of lazy morning where neither of us had anywhere to be, and he rolled over to face me with this serious expression that made my heart skip. "Marry me," he said. I blinked. "Is that a question or a demand?" "Both. Neither. I don't care." He was fumbling in the nightstand drawer, pulling out a simple silver band. "I know we haven't talked about this, and maybe it's too soon, but I've known since about month 2 that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with you, however long or short that is. So Alex, will you marry me?" I kissed him instead of answering, and he took that as the yes it was meant to be. We got married 6 months later, in a small ceremony at the bookstore where we met. Ruth, the owner, had insisted, and how could we say no? My sister cried through the entire thing, and Daniel's mom, who had flown in from Eastern Washington, kept hugging me and telling me how happy she was that her son had found me. Daniel's students had made us a card that everyone in his class had signed, full of misspelled congratulations and drawings of stick figures holding hands. Standing there in the poetry section, holding Daniel's hands while our friend Marcus, who'd gotten ordained online specifically for this, read the vows we'd written, I thought about that version of me from 2 years ago, the one who'd been so tired, so ready to give up. I wished I could go back and tell him that it gets better, that there's a tall teacher with kind eyes and terrible jokes waiting in a bookstore, that love can find you even in your darkest moments, and sometimes that love gives you a reason to fight when you've run out of your own reasons. I wished I could tell him that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about finding something worth living for. "I love you," I whispered to Daniel, as Marcus pronounced us married, and the small crowd of friends and family cheered. "I love you too," Daniel said, and kissed me like we had all the time in the world. And maybe we did, or maybe we didn't, but standing there in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that we had right now, and right now was everything.